want to welcome everyone to this virtual town hall on the homeless crisis. My name is Lynn Schulman, and I'm running for City Council to represent Forest Hills, Rego Park, Kew Gardens, Richmond Hill, and a very small piece of Meadow Village. Homelessness is a major crisis in our city and in our community. On an average night, there are over 56,000 people that are in shelters, that are sleeping in shelters. And that's really awful. About 18,000 of those are children. In addition, the homeless crisis has really been exacerbated by COVID. And I know that some of you in our community, you're more familiar with people who are on the street. And the people who are on the street mostly have mental health issues or other major health crises that need to be dealt with. The major reason for homelessness is that people don't have the ability to have affordable housing, and we really need to do something about that. Tonight, we have some really great guest speakers that are going to talk about the homeless situation. And while we're not going to solve homelessness tonight, what we are going to do is hopefully get the seeds for future conversations and for future solutions that we can work on together. We're going to be addressed by our own Assembly Member in Forest Hills, Andrew Hevesi, who is the chair of the Children and Families Committee. He was previously chair of the Social Services Committee. He's done a ton of work on the homeless issue and has done a lot in this community. And he will talk about some of the things that he's been working on. We also have Dr. Lilliam Barrios-Paoli, who was the former Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, most recently. And prior to that, she was a commissioner of the Human Resources Administration, which also covered the Department for Homeless Services. And she will talk about the different groups of people that are homeless, because it's not a one size fits all. There are many degrees of homelessness. Some people were evicted because they lost their jobs, or somebody had a crisis and couldn't pay the rent for some reason. So, and there are children and there are adults and all different kinds of groups. So she's going to talk about some potential solutions. And we're also going to be addressed by an advocate who operates a community-based organization called Monkworks, Father Mike, who will be on a little bit later, and talk about some of the services they're actually doing for us in our community in Queens. I do want to say that there's a list of homeless resources that is going to be on my website. It's Schulman, SCHULMAN 2021.com. And we also, by the way, once we're done with the speakers, we're going to open it up for question and answer and hopefully have a robust conversation. And so with that, I want to introduce Assembly Member Andrew Hevesi, who will be our first speaker. Assemblyman Hevesi.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you so much for inviting me here, and everybody. Good evening, everybody. Lynn, thanks for everything you do for our community. I've been working with you for years, and I look forward to continuing to do that. It's not going to be easy for me to talk about the entire homeless crisis in 4 minutes. I'll give you a good sense of where I think we are. Lynn is right. The numbers of our homeless crisis, by the way, we've been saying homeless crisis for over a decade, and it has continually gotten worse, basically due to government failure or ineptitude, particularly the state government. New York City, I will tell you, has been trying hard to solve this crisis with varying results, but New York State has gotten out of the business of homelessness and helping people, and I will touch on that a little bit. But because of the state's lack of focus and a lack of investment and resources, over a couple of different pots of money, those for rental supplements to keep people in their homes. But primarily, if I'm going to fault the state, I got to go back a good, 50 years or 40 years to when we start to close the mental hospitals and institutions in upstate New York with the promise of, yeah, your institution send these people with needs home into their communities. We promise there'll be funds. And that was a lie. It was a flat out lie. And we're not serving these people. And those are many of the people you wind up on the streets. So the numbers are terrible. We are in a cycle of generational homelessness. And I will, Lynn touched on, I think you said it was 18,000 kids is the last count in shelter. I think when you start adding those numbers of kids up, who are not in shelter as well, who are doubled up on other people's couches, you're getting close to over 100,000 statewide. And from my perspective, that's a childhood trauma. So once you inflict that trauma on those kids, the statistics prove that they're exponentially more likely to live in generational poverty, to become homeless themselves, to wind up in the criminal justice system, to fail out of school. You get the sense. So it's dumb government. But I'll tell you where we are now, because we're sort of an inflection point, a crisis point. So because of COVID, we had to lock everyone down. And one of the results of that is people who can't work, can't pay their rent. So the number of people who are at risk for becoming homeless have skyrocketed over the last couple of months due to COVID. Now we've put on Band-Aids. The governor has put on some, the federal government has put on some, the moratoriums on forcing people to pay rents. And they're good Band-Aids, they've worked so far, but there's gonna come a check due at a very short time frame for everybody who has been gaining arrears and may fall into homelessness. So the state is looking to act. I will tell you where we are right now. So first, as a general principle, New York State doesn't have a lot of money now because the tax revenue we've relied on for the last couple of years has dried up. However, the federal government came through with $1.3 billion for rent supplements for those who are impacted by COVID. We are currently in the process in Albany of trying to figure out, okay, who gets that 1.3? How are we going to make sure that people don't fall into homelessness? And what do we do to take care of the populations that are already there? We're having those conversations now. And I will tell you what I've been telling my colleagues in Albany, which is that 1.3, while it should be just the start, and I believe the Biden administration and my colleagues at the federal level are going to come through with another stimulus package, which contains a lot of money for rent supplements. The truth is, I don't think it's going to be able to cover all of the rent arrears we've been accruing over the last couple of months and help all the people who are currently homeless. So my advocacy for my colleagues when they're deliberating, how do we spend this 1.3 billion is, it is irresponsible just to spend that 1.3 without attaching a long-term plan to it for rent supplements, targeting the people who are already homeless or are at the highest risk of homelessness. And you'll hear the doctor talk about this. I'm sure some of the populations that are most at risk are those who lose their housing due to domestic violence, or they live in hazardous conditions, or even right now, they can't pay the rent. So my argument to my colleagues is you have to attach a long-term plan and subject that plan to the availability of future funds. And we should raise taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers. I don't like raising taxes, but as an elected official looking around what's happening in our state and our communities from COVID, I would raise taxes to do that. I think, Lynn, I could end there. I could go into more detail about supportive housing, which is the other end. But the impetus for us right now is to make sure that we keep people in their homes. Because the fact for me is, if you help people pay their rent and help them stay in their homes, first, the outcomes are better for families, which is what you want. But second, just as importantly, you are paying 1/3 the cost that it actually will cost every taxpayer, every one of us, to put people in shelters. Part of the problem, I believe, and this is where I'm going to end, Lynn, be a little bit adversarial, but part of the problem you're dealing with the homeless crisis in New York, I believe, is you have a homeless shelter complex, an industry of providers that make money the more people fall into homelessness. And it's a reverse counterintuitive incentive for government to allow the numbers of homeless people to grow. And they've been letting them grow over the years. And now we're at a crisis point, and we have to act to pull our way out of it. And that's our responsibility. And since I don't want to talk for an hour, I'm going to say thank you, and I'll take questions later. But thank you, Lynn, for having me here. And thanks everybody for listening. This was cathartic for me. Thank you.
And to your point, Assembly Member, the $3 billion with a B is spent each year on shelters.
Yeah.
So, shelter system.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. With that, I want to introduce Dr. Lilliam Barrios-Paoli, and please take the floor.
So thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. And I see that there's some friends of mine watching me. So hi, Angela. I've been involved in the issue of homelessness since the very early 80s. In fact, I was working at HRA when the consent decree was signed. And I think that the big mistake of the consent decree is that it's not that I don't believe in the right to shelter, it's that I believe in the right to housing. And I think that by making it temporary and an emergency at that point in time, we never really solved the problem at a point where it was probably solvable. So now we are at a situation where it's an issue of affordability. If you work for minimum wage and you're making anywhere between $15,000 to $25,000 a year, and an apartment in the South Bronx, which you cannot find honestly, costs you $1,500 a month. Do the math. 3/4 of your income is going to go for housing. How are you going to feed your family? How are you going to buy your medicines? How are you going to afford anything else? So in essence, if you don't provide a housing subsidy, that family is going to be fighting eviction forever. And the idea, and then we've provided subsidies that are time limited, as if families out of a sudden miraculously, with very few skills, are going to start making a lot of more money and they don't need the subsidy anymore. And it's a little bit like what we do for food stamps, what we do for Medicaid, recognizing that there are people who need the subsidy in an ongoing way. And prevention is always much better than when we try to solve the problem afterwards. So I think, for families, it is an issue of affordability, and rental subsidies make a lot of sense. And you have to pay it up to a certain income level and, for however long. And then you have to maybe provide training programs so people can upgrade their jobs. You can do a lot of mixes, but the reality is inescapable. It is an issue of I cannot afford to pay the rent that the city at this point in time, it's demanding. But however, the only issue is not just affordability. I mean, domestic violence is mostly what people say that is the reason that they're homeless. Now, clearly, if poverty is insidious, and the amount of stress that people live under, really takes you to domestic violence. So what comes first, with the poverty and domestic violence, they go hand in hand. And I do think that when people are housed stably, their lives are much, much better, and they can really go from there. In terms of singles that are homeless, the population in a single shelter is about 50% people coming out of incarceration, prisons and jails. And the other 50% are people who are either have substance abuse or mental health issues. So you cannot solve that by one model. We used to have options in the city. People had rooming houses, people had SROs. Well-meaningly, we did away with these things because we thought people should have better housing, and I don't disagree with that. But we have to recreate that model and provide different options so that people don't, not everybody needs to have a one-bedroom apartment because we don't have enough of those. So can we create alternative housing models for the single population that tends to be a little more unstable, but still needs to be housed someplace? And then you have the street homeless, which, it takes about 7 years to convince somebody to come off the streets. It's a very long-term process. People have gotten used to being there. Safe havens work. You can convince people with a minimum level of requirements that they can have a key, lock their door, and be safe. I think when you start demanding sobriety and put a lot of rules, people just get turned off and leave. And I think once you house them, you can then work with them. I mean, I think that's the premise. Once they have a stable place to be, then you can begin to do all the other good things. So I think, it's a matter of triaging the population, looking as to why people are homeless. It's not one size fits all. But at the end of the day, we have to create new models of housing, and we have to look into affordability and support services for those that have mental health issues and have substance abuse issues. So I'll end there, and then we can go into questions.
So before we do that, I want to see, is Father Mike on? Is Father Mike here? No? Okay. He'll hopefully come in later. So I want to open it up for a question and answer. So what you should do is You can do one or two things. You can, on the reaction icon on the bottom, you can raise your hand. The other option too is that you can put something in the chat. So,
Then I think I found Father Mike, by the way.
oh, you did. All right. So let's do that. Father Mike.
Hey, how are you guys? Good evening.
Hi, sorry about that. So let me introduce you properly, Father. This is Father Mike, who is with an organization called Monkworks, and they do a lot of work with the homeless, particularly in Queens. And so, Father Mike, you want to talk a little bit about what you do?
Yes, good evening again to everyone. So my name is Father Mike Lopez. I'm the Executive Director of Monkworks Social Services. We are a very grassroots not-for-profit that focuses on working with vulnerable street homeless populations. We like to coin ourselves as the experts in street homeless populations. I'm very glad that Dr. Barrios-Paoli said that safe havens work. This is what we do. This is our model, particularly as we focus on street homelessness. We currently operate 3 bed stabilization programs in Queens, 1 in Ridgewood, 2 in Elmhurst. We also operate the Queens Warming Center, also in Elmhurst, which is a weather-based warming center for those who are, out in the cold. And we run that out of one of our churches in Elmhurst as well. And we're really focused on working with street populations that refuse to come indoors. More often than not, we hear that because of the dangerous situation, particularly at DHS shelters, people are afraid to come off the street. And so what we do is create small community-based bed programs that are focused on bringing the local street homeless populations off the streets and into safe beds. We work collaboratively, throughout Queens and actually throughout the city for the past year with the COVID response, working both with street homeless populations and also food insecure families. And we're seeing that the community keeps growing. The street homeless population continues to grow. We're constantly looking for resources. We hope that both the city and the state look at opportunities like the programs that we're running, which are smaller faith-based community bed programs that really focus on getting vulnerable street populations off the street. Currently, we house 75 men. We're hoping to begin to open a women's program in our community. We continue to see the need, particularly as it pertains to mental health and also physical health with those who are living on the street. And it really is our focus to just create these small, safer environments where we can help to get some people transition from street living into a stabilization program and move them along towards more permanent housing solutions. I'm very, very happy to be here with our friend Andy Hevesi, who's been a great supporter of our work, and some of the other people who are on here. We have great partnerships in Forest Hills with the Church in the Gardens, who has been a supporter of our work. We've worked with the Reformed Temple in Forest Hills as well, who have been good supporters of the work that we're doing. And then we just want to continue to be focused on our street homeless population and understand that this is really the gateway to, like Andy said, generational homelessness. And so, step by step, we continue to focus on these things. We really want to advocate that on the government level, that those who are who have these positions of authority really look towards the street homeless population and the vulnerability of those people and work to get them off the street in the same manner that they do in the larger scale shelter systems. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Father Mike. Really appreciate it. We have some questions. So one thing we're going to do, I saw Hank Krumholtz had his hand up first. So can we unmute Hank, folks, so you can ask his question?
Hank, you should be able to unmute yourself right now.
Oh, okay, I unmuted myself. First, I would like to thank Lynn for Schulman for hosting this meeting. It's very important. And I'd like to thank Andy Hevesi and Lillian, because homelessness is a terrible thing for a person to go through. So Angie, can you unmute yourself because I'd like to ask you a question, please? Okay. My friend was on the verge of homelessness, and he was able to get into a place in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, where the most he would pay is based on his income is 30%. I don't know what program, whether that was state or city, because rather he was going to lose, he had no money to pay the rent for his apartment in Jackson Heights. And everybody knows Jackson Heights, how expensive it is to live there. And he got to it. And so now 2 questions. Could we build more housing for people where their income is capped at 30%? And I grew up in NYCHA, and on the NYCHA also it was based on income. Is there any more money coming from the federal government to build more NYCHA housing in New York City, or it just has to go to NYCHA repairs because for the last 10 years, NYCHA went downhill. So sorry to ask you a long question. So 1, the 30% for more income, and 2, to build more NYCHA housing. Thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you. So, so to answer the question, so first, 30%, I believe, and the Dr. Paoli can confirm this. That's the affordability threshold that you want to hit. There are a variety of programs, both from the state and the city, that cap the amount that somebody who qualifies for those programs pay into as a portion of their rent. And the city does a number of them. They have multiple living in communities programs. They're called the LINK programs. The state has another one that caps at 30% for people who are living with HIV and AIDS. So there's a variety of those. But yeah, that's a good model. The problem, and this is not, I want to say this in a nice way. My problem with most of the rent supplements that are existing, and they are very helpful, don't misunderstand. There are rent supplements that are keeping people housed, and I encourage that, but they have not kept up with the market rate. So what you're seeing is rent supplements that are capped at a certain amount, and the market rates are exponentially higher. So sometimes our rent supplements are not even allowing people to get the apartments they need. So, but you're right about the 30%, and we should be able to build that into to smart programs going forward, because you don't want people, particularly people who are vulnerable to becoming homeless, to have to pay more than 30% of their rent. Now, for the NYCHA issue, the answer is no. I don't believe any more money is coming from NYCHA. And I will tell you from the federal government for NYCHA. And here's a real problem that I run into constantly in Albany, and a little bit of the politics I will jump into here. So NYCHA has it was a federally funded program that the city is supposed to administer, and I think the city pays some portion of it as well. Problem is that the federal government got out of the business of giving money to NYCHA years ago, and the city has had trouble keeping up. Now, as an elected official, I don't have NYCHA in my building, but in my district, but many of my colleagues do. And they are constantly saying to the state, hey, you got to come up with more money. And our response is, hey, we have contributed some money, but the onus for NYCHA is on the federal government. And if you're talking about repairs to the tune of billions of dollars, 30 or 40 billion just to do repairs. So NYCHA's got a real problem. They're not going to be able to get money out of the state. I don't believe the federal government is getting involved, and it'll be next up to another city administration to try to make it whole. But NYCHA is a real problem, and as far as I'm concerned, on many levels, a failure of government where we're leaving people cold. But I'll leave the doctor to talk about that.
Let me just add one thing. I mean, when the federal government was giving Section 8s, the issue of sustainable subsidies was taken care of. And
Right.
the reality is that people that had a voucher, a Section 8 voucher, did very well. Once the federal government stopped doing that and there were no new vouchers, then the real problem, as we know, it has emerged. I think we have to lobby intensely the federal government to produce more Section 8s, because that will incentivize the private sector to rent to people that have the voucher, because they know the voucher is not going to go away. And it's not just New York City problem. I mean, most large cities have the same issue. So it's a federal issue for sure.
I agree.
Thank you. So there's a
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So there's a question in the chat that I'm going to read, and then we'll go to folks that have their hands raised. So Mark Laster, Andy asked a question about Assembly Member Bramwell's bill to make the AMI tied to the zip codes. Can you address that?
Yeah, I can address it. I haven't seen the bill, so I really apologize, Mark, and I'm going to be mad at you for stumping me. But yeah, I have not read that bill. I think Barnwell's great. I'll take a read through, and I can tell you offline what I think about it. But he's a smart guy, so I'll take a read through. But I apologize to everybody here. I do not know the substance of that bill, so I don't want to comment on it that I'm for or against it.
So just to give some background, the AMI is the average median income that's used to determine what rents are. So there's a percentage of it in terms of making something affordable. And the problem has been that the average median income for New York is tied to the region. And that means that there are wealthier parts of the region like Westchester County and other places that those incomes are put in with New York City's income. So what happens is the average median income is a lot higher. I think in New York, it's about 100,000, somewhere in there. So that's a problem, because what that means is they take that number and then they figure out what an affordable rent is based on that high number. So what I think what Bramwell is trying to, Bramwell's not the only one. There have been some proposals to make the AMI tied to a zip code rather than tied to a region. So I think that's basically, I don't know the details of his bill, but that's what proponents have been proposing. So I just wanted to give people sort of a sense of what's going on, and we'll follow up. We'll follow up and see, we'll talk about Bramwell's bill, see if we can get an answer at some other point. I want to recognize Michael Conviero. Can we unmute him?
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Hello. And a couple of things. One, Father Mike Lopez, I just want to say hello. I worked, volunteered a couple of times with Father Mike when he was at St. Matthias he had a soup kitchen there. He did a wonderful job there. And just a quick story with Father Mike Lopez. He had someone in the neighborhood who was being, this is now in Brooklyn, who had been living alone in a building, being treated very unfairly. And he brought it to my attention. And I'm happy to say that we contacted her son, who actually is in the Marines, came here. There was an attorney trying to take over the building. We've now settled it. And I had let Father Mike recently know that the son is in the process of now selling the building. The lawyer was trying to take the building away. And the woman was literally living with no heat, no hot water, nothing, until Father Mike came in. And thank God he did. And we were able to help out this woman. So Father Mike and I know each other from, we're fellow cigar smokers. But with that being said, Assemblyman Hevesi, I have a question just regarding, I spoke to Brian Barnwell about this. Scott Stringer had said a few years back that the city owns about 1,500 properties that could be used to help house the homeless, as opposed to putting them in hotels. At the rate of giving hotel owners around $300,000 a month. There's a $1.5 billion budget that homeless services has. But the prong of my question, and I want to also round this out to Ms. Paoli, is that could legislation be put up to make New York a resident-only state, so that just the residents of New York City, New York State would be able to access homeless services here, because the floodgates are open. And people who are not getting into homeless shelters in other states are coming here, and we're accepting them. And I'm not saying that we don't want to be generous, but we don't have enough room. And unfortunately, now it's creating a crisis that 1.5 billion isn't enough. In addition to that, we used to have faith-based shelters, one of which I worked in at Sacred Heart in Glendale for 10 years. I used to go in from midnight to 7 a.m. And basically, they would bring in people from a shelter in the city. They'd come in at night. People would volunteer, make dinners. At night, we would do laundry. In the morning, we'd make breakfast, and then in the morning, a bus would come to pick them up, and then bring them back into the city to look for work. So my question is, could we introduce legislation to make New York a resident-only state? Could we use the properties that we have here? Could we help the lobby to bring in that Section 8 again, so people could assimilate into society instead of being ostracized and being treated like cattle in hotels and not being respected? and work to help bring down the population so that people will have the ability to assimilate. I own properties. I had Section 8 tenants. They paid the rent. The rent came in like clockwork. They were good people. When that goes away, you create people not being able to live in an apartment anymore. Instead, they have to go into the shelter system. And that also takes away, unfortunately, from their dignity, and that's a shame. And the federal government, I know, has the money to do that. And I'd like to know how we could get Section 8 back and maybe make New York a resident-only state. And Lynn, thank you for having this. This is a really good, this is really good to have, because people need to understand this better. And I do have a lot of knowledge about it, and I want to share it here tonight as much as I can. So thank you.
So that's me. Thank you, Michael. So there's a bunch of questions in there. Let me start with, yes, Section 8, we should be lobbying the federal government to, especially now with, and I don't want to get political here, but with the current party that controls everything in Washington now, I think you have a little bit of a better chance to get Section 8 back up and running. And I know there are advocates who are advocating for that. I think they're a little busy trying to get the stimulus money out. But yes, the Section 8 lobbying in Washington is a very smart move. As for the properties, Scott Stringer is very smart. If he says there are properties that are out there that can be accessible, I believe him. Problem with doing that is you've got to, I don't know if you said that they were already purchased by the city. If they are, great. If they're not, you got to get them. Then you have to build them out, which costs an incredible amount of money, and then you have to go back to nonprofit providers to put up those facilities. So that's possible. It seems like a heavy lift to me. And then let me go back to the last question, which I've encountered a lot over the last couple of years: a residency requirement. I totally understand it, and I appreciate the idea. I believe it's in violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, and I've tried to pass some bills along those lines, and were shot down. Couldn't even get them out of the assembly. So I don't believe we're allowed to do that. But I understand the logic for the residency requirements, because we're afraid that people are coming to New York City. And I know that's true. However, I will tell you, having talked to my colleagues throughout the state about homelessness for the last couple of years, the people upstate swear that New York City is sending our homeless up to them. I mean, I get yelled at from colleagues from Chautauqua and Binghamton to say, stop sending your homeless up here. So it's a little bit all over the place. But yeah, go ahead, Dr.
Yeah,
Paoli.
but there's also the fact that the city signed a consent decree in court for the right to shelter.
Right.
And whatever the stipulations are in that right to shelter cannot be changed without going back to court. So if we wanted to, make it regional or put any kind of eligibility criteria to it, it would have to go back to court and be renegotiated in court. So yeah, and that's a very heavy lift, because I think that it's a difficult situation. It's the city in the 70s and 80s, when the city was having through the fiscal crisis. The city of New York was the biggest landlord in the city of New York, and we had thousands and thousands of buildings that we took in rem in place of taxes. I was commissioner of HPD towards the tail end of the in rem situation, and it was a nightmare. The city is a horrible landlord, frankly. So the idea that we still may have some properties, but properties are not always going, you may have them, but they may not be in the best places. They may not be close to, to transportation, to schools. They may not be the type of building you can easily rehab and accommodate, any kind of shelter or apartments. So it's a very complicated situation. It's not, as you say, it's possible. I think it'd be difficult. By the way, the city also has land, and it could do a land trust and build, but that's something we look at.
Thank you. And John, there's somebody named John asked what my position is, and the first thing I thought of was what the assemblyman said. I remember from my law school days, if you're trying to make something regional or whatever, it's the Interstate Commerce Clause. And so that's a major issue, but I perfectly understand where folks are coming from with that. So I just, I did want to mention that. We have a question from Allison Sesso that's in the chat, and it's a long question, so I apologize. I have to want to preventive measures, investments are critical. Rent subsidies, affordable housing, but we also need to stop underfunding the nonprofits on the ground running the shelters. When I ran an association of nonprofit organizations, we rated the shelter RFP in New York City, and it was terrible. To run the shelters well on behalf of the city, they have to fundraise. We've turned them into party planners. How can we fund those contracts better? So either one of you want to ask that.
I'll take that one. Doctor, you feel free, but I'm ready to go on that one. So
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, it's not just the homelessness. I mean, the city underfunds all the services. It pays about 80% of whatever the cost is, and then they have to go and fundraise from their boards or whomever they can. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the big structural things we have to change is that the city has to begin to pay for the cost of services to the not-for-profits. We've created an underclass of people who work in those contracts that don't get paid anything. So, you know, in essence, we're exploiting people to serve other people who are even poor. So yeah, it's a horrible situation, no question about it. Allison is completely right. Hi, Allison.
can I piggyback on that, Lynn? Is that okay? So Allison, you're 100% right. And Dr. Paoli is 100% right. I'll speak from the state perspective and leave the doctor to talk about the city and Lynn to talk about the city perspective. The state perspective is New York State for the last decade has been systematically underfunding all of its nonprofits on purpose. The governor has set up what he calls a 2% cap on state spending. And there's 4% growth in, and think about that, 2% cap, 4% growth in education, 4% growth in health, which are the two biggest parts of the budget. Nonprofits are the other part. So nonprofits, by definition, if you have to be at 2% and those two are at 4%, where do nonprofits go? 0, or they're getting cut. And then the doctor's also 100% right. My understanding of the nonprofit workforce in New York State is about 80% minority and close to that number, mostly female, and about 60% of them are paid poverty wages, so they have to be on public assistance. What we're doing in our nonprofit sector is an outrage for decades. Plus, let me add this, since you set me up on this one. For the last year, Governor Cuomo has intentionally withheld $5 billion in CARES Act funds from every nonprofit. He's had access to it. We've been pushing him to let this money go. He's let a little bit go, but it's a control issue for this gentleman. And what's happened is our nonprofits, and we're talking homeless here, but if I could switch gears for a second, our childcare providers are going out of business constantly. We have food insecurity, the highest rates we've ever had. He's cutting back on that. Everything you do not want to do in a pandemic, New York State has done, and they say they're doing it because we don't have money and we're being fiscally responsible. Well, number one, they do have the money, and number two, that is the dumbest fiscal argument I've ever heard. The smart money is you fund the nonprofits to take care of the most vulnerable, because the most vulnerable, if they don't get those services, are going to cost you more money when they wind up in emergency rooms or in homeless shelters. So New York State has been remarkably stupid in how we're handling our nonprofits. So Allison is right. Thank you for letting me get that off my chest. I don't have to see my therapist this weekend now. Thank you.
So I want to ask if, because John still has his hand up, although it may just be up from before. John, do you have another question, or was that?
I do have another question. Although I'll just comment, as I recall it, when Bloomberg was mayor, I believe there was an 18-month requirement of residency in the city before you could receive homeless services. I don't know if that's what Dr. Paoli was referring to in terms of consent decree. I don't think that Bloomberg's that requirement was challenged to court, but I'll put that aside. So, Ms. Schulman, excuse me, you're a candidate for council. You've been in city government for some time. What specifically do you propose that the city of New York do to address this issue? I live in Forest Hills. I'm up on Austin Street. I'm up on 71st around the train station. There's a huge problem up there. There's no getting away from it. And I feel very empathetic. I will buy people food. I will give them sandwiches, but it has grown tremendously during the time that de Blasio has been mayor. So now, and while Karen Costos was council person. So now you're running for office. What exactly do you propose to do from the perspective of the city of New York to address this issue?
You know, John, it's a good question, and yes, homelessness has increased in our neighborhood, and you know that's why we're having this discussion here today, because there's no one solution. I will tell you that, you know, what people usually do, or sometimes do when they see homeless people on the street is, and especially we have had in this community, some homeless who are a little bit, have some violent tendencies. But I will tell you, when you call the police to come and address the situation, what happens is they take them to a facility that has a psychiatric ward. And they usually come out within 24 hours and they're back out on the street. So that's not really a solution. So what we need is some what's called supportive housing. And I know Mark Laster put in the chat and asked, which we'll get to right after I respond to you. How does supportive housing help homelessness? Supportive housing actually helps. They provide social services. They provide mental health services. They provide psychiatrists. They provide all different kinds of services. And they have people there on 24 hours a day to provide different services to get people back on track. If somebody has a substance abuse problem, they have drug programs, they have different things like that. And that's the best way to actually get somebody into a program like that so that they can be off the street. So that's one. We have to really take a deep dive. I will tell you that the Human Resources Administration spends billions and billions, as I mentioned before, on the shelter system, and the shelter system is not the best, and there's different kinds of rules for different kinds of places, and it's just a mishmash. So we really have to take a deep dive and basically do an audit of the Department of Public Services to see where people are staying at, what works and what doesn't. There's a program that I want to mention. It's called WIN, Women in Need. That's a program run by Chris Quinn, who is the former Speaker of the City Council. That is a program, because I work in the council now, that is a program that's used as a best practice in terms of getting families off the street. So there are different aspects of this, and we have to look at the different models and the different things that work and do it that way. There's no one solution. If there was, that would be great. But those are the types of things that I want to look at. And we also probably need to do an audit of the homeless that we have in this district, in this area, to see why they're homeless and to see what's going on with them and see how we can be helpful. Some people will need different services than others. So that's some of the things that I would like to look at as a member of the City Council. So I want to ask Mark Laster had a question, which I think Dr. Paoli, you can answer, is to what degree supportive housing helps with the homeless situation. That's basically, I think, what he was asking.
So supportive housing is incredibly helpful for people who have either substance abuse or mental health issues. The problem with supportive housing is that it's a costly model. It's difficult to replicate, it's difficult to run, and it's costly, but it's very effective, incredibly effective. There are some models that do supportive housing for families. They have also been incredibly successful. So for the people who are more frail, for families who are more frail, I think the model really works, and it's worth investing. I mean, I think that Assemblyman Hevesi was right. I mean, the reality is that, and I used to say, a scholarship to Harvard may be $60,000. A scholarship to Rikers is about 112, right? So, essentially you're spending double when you let the problem just fester. And the same thing happens with homelessness and with lack of affordable housing and everything else. So the reality is that it's worth spending the money, even though it's a costly model. And, the state has participated in the New York programs with the city in creating supportive housing, but it's been incredibly slow and not done enough. I mean, no question about it. And it's become political. So it becomes a haggling thing. Yes.
Yeah, can I jump in on that, Lynn? Is that okay? So the doctor's 100% right. So I've always looked at homelessness. If you want to solve to the extent you can solve, there will always be some number of homeless people. But if you want to really take a dent out of it, you look at homelessness in two ways. Number one, you stop the flow of people becoming homeless. You got to do that right away. That's a rent supplement. On the flip side, when you have people who are on the streets, like the doctor said, who have mental illness, New York created the supportive housing model. New York State invented it in the 1970s. It's a great model now, and while it is expensive, it's the best way to deal with people who are chronically homeless or have other kinds of ailments, mental illness. That's the way you deal with them. Now, I'm going to hit the state government again. The doctor is right. Historically, going back to, I think, the first Cuomo, New York City and New York State entered into agreements every decade or so called the New York agreements. And basically what it was an agreement. The city says, I'm going to put up, I'm making these numbers up, 15,000 units of supportive housing. And the state says, okay, I'll match that. We'll do 30 total. Every governor and every mayor has done that and gotten along until Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio, who can't agree on anything and hate each other viscerally. So there was no New York agreement. So what we did a couple of years ago, to the credit of the New York State legislature, was push Andrew Cuomo and force him to announce that he's going to create 20,000 units of supportive housing, and push Mayor de Blasio to announce 15. The mayor is in the process of getting those 15 out. Governor Cuomo, that was 5 years ago. He has released $1 billion, and that has already started the creation of, let me get the numbers right, 6,000 units of supportive housing, but has not funded the rest, and has not entered into any sort of agreement except with the mayor, except he made an announcement at the state of the state. So the governor came out with a huge promise several years ago. We're going to build supportive housing. It's going to be great. And then didn't fund it. So once again, New York State falling down on the job. But Mark is right, and Lynn and the doctor are right. Supportive housing is invaluable. If you're going to get rid of the vast majority of people becoming homeless, it's got to be a 1-2 punch of prevention through supplements and then supportive housing.
We have a question in the chat as part of the problem that while there are many public and private agencies and groups trying to address the problem, there is not one overall entity coordinating a solution to the problem.
Doctor, you want that or you want me?
Well, I know the reality is that the Department of Homeless Services is supposed to be doing that. Whether they're not doing it well is a different question, but that's why it was created. That's why it was taken out of HRA to pay attention to the question of homelessness and coordinate all of the different programs and create new models and do all that work. Now, the problem is, and with many city agencies, is that they operate on an emergency basis all the time because there's always a crisis, and so management takes second seat to whatever the crisis of the day is, which is a real shame.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question about one entity that oversees everything. If you're talking about the city of New York, the doctor is right. It's HRA is the umbrella over the Department of Homeless Services, and they're technically responsible. But my feeling about HRA, and you'll notice I don't beat up the city as much as I beat up the state, because the city makes concerted efforts to try to house as many people as possible, give as many rent supplements as possible. They really do make an effort. The state doesn't. So, the idea of having one group in charge, yeah, it works in principle, but I've found that the Department of Homeless Services and the city of New York has been in crisis mode. All they spend their time doing, as far as I can see, and they do a lot of good stuff, and I don't want to disparage them, but they are constantly trying to put people in beds. That's their primary goal. How many beds do we need tonight? How many hotels do we need to rent out? Because we have a right to shelter where by law, everybody's entitled to a bed. So the city has been in crisis mode. I've been watching this closely for about 7 or 8 years. So yeah, they're doing the best they can, but it's not solving the problem. They're just trying to handle each crisis to the best of their ability.
Yep. That may well be. I'm going to actually not so much dump on the city, but I will tell you that in the council, one of my assignments is to work with HRA and DHS, and I work with a lot of homeless individuals who have complaints, and to get them the service that they actually are supposed to be getting is really daunting. And so I've worked with the homeless, I've worked with the agencies, and I know what they're able to do and what they're not able to do. And that's some of the frustration. I will tell you that, first of all, believe it or not, there are a lot of municipal workers who are homeless, who go to work every day and they go back to the shelter at night. I will tell you also that as of December of last year, we have 2,800 students in this community education council district who are homeless. And so that is, we have to really do something about that. The students, there are a lot of CUNY students, college students who are homeless. I met somebody about a little over a year ago before COVID started, was a CUNY student who actually was sleeping on the subway. Her mother was sick and couldn't take care of her, and she was sleeping on the subway and going to school during the day. And it was really terrible. And so we need to look into the different kinds of services that we can provide to prevent some of this. And we also have to make sure that the agencies that, one of the responsibilities, the biggest responsibility that the city council has is oversight. We really need to make sure that the agencies are doing what they're supposed to do and helping the people they're supposed to help. So that's a big part of it. And that's something that I'm very committed to. Do we have, let me see if we have, Mike, I know you have your hand up. I want to see if there was somebody else that, yeah, though, I just want to get to some other folks before I go back. Jill McKenzie wrote, she's a nurse working in Manhattan Hospital, caring for many homeless population who just want a meal, a change of clothes, and a shower. Why do they not want to go to the shelters? I'm going to leave that up to you guys. I mean, go ahead.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Why do
Please.
people, why do people not want to go to use the shelters, basically?
Oof, okay.
Oh,
Doctor,
you
is
know,
that, go ahead.
I mean, I think that the idea that people don't want to go to shelter is basically in a single category, single men's shelter particularly, because there's violence in those shelters. Because you put together all kinds of people, you don't triage them, you don't figure out, you put very vulnerable people together with very violent people, people coming out of prison with people who have mental illness, so you create a very chaotic situation. You also don't have enough, a lot of space. You have beds and beds and beds and beds. Usually they're very large places. So you create a situation that is less than optimal for people to feel safe and for people to feel that they're taken care of. Not every shelter is like that. Clearly, there are organizations that run very well-run shelters and they don't have that kind of situation. But that's the myth, and I think a lot of people are afraid of going into shelter because of that.
Yeah, and Lynn, if I could jump in on that. So one of the things I had the privilege of doing is working with the Coalition from the Homeless and being on their shelter monitors list, which allowed us, me and some members of my staff who are on this call, to go just randomly drop into shelters. It's one thing if an elected official shows up dressed like this and says, hey, give me a tour. Well, magically, everything's really nice. If you go in jeans and a t-shirt, you get a different response at different hours of the day. And I will tell you that there are some shelter providers that do outstanding work. They really do. And they're really trying to help people. And then just like any other business, there are some who are terrible. And if you consider the conflux of circumstances, number one, many of the people in the shelters are mentally ill. Second, there is a prison to shelter pipeline, which we haven't really talked about. I think the doctor mentioned it, which is the prisons put people on a bus and their parole officers tell them, you got to go to the shelters. That's where you go. If you're not in that shelter, you're going to be violated and you'll wind up back in jail. So right there, the population is a little tough. But then you go and some of these shelter providers are unscrupulous. So some of the facilities are terrible. There is a heavy smell of drug use in there. The security guards are the lowest paid people anywhere I've seen, and they are one step away from being homeless themselves. It's just a place for anybody, and I've had this conversation with my friends who've gone into the shelters. It's just a place, if you don't have to go to a shelter, yeah, that's not your first choice. So that's the issue that people are dealing with. So I completely understand a person making the rational decision. You know what? I'm going to go sleep on a park bench because I don't want to, it's safer there because I don't want to go into some of these shelters. That is a rational, reasonable decision. And that's a failure of government to have shelters like that. But that's the reality.
I'm going to ask Ryan Kelly has a question. Do you want to unmute him? Unmute Ryan?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my question's for Ms. Schulman. And I think, as a candidate for city council, you're in that unique position where you're able to directly control policy in the city. And I think one of the people that we have in the district for the position you're running for is Karen Koslowitz, who is a is our councilwoman. And it's also unique because she's donated directly to your campaign, according to the New York City Campaign Finance Board. But she seems to be MIA on homelessness. I mean, do you think she's doing a good job on homelessness as somebody and as a councilwoman who's actually endorsing you in terms of this policy area?
You know, that's not a question for this forum tonight. This is a forum that's on the subject matter of homelessness for the community. If you want to ask me a question in terms of my campaign or anything else, because I don't want to turn this into that, you can write to me at lynn@schulman2021.com, and I'd be more than happy to answer your question.
Hey, Lynn, can I take that just for a second to jump in? Because I've worked with Karen on homelessness in this district and other places. It's not, an easy topic, but yeah, she has been in the discussions with me when we're trying to figure out policy at the state level. She's been advocating. I can show you 10 letters. I'm making up the number, but a number of letters where she's been pushing for some of the things that we've been talking about, supportive housing and rent supplements. So I just disagree with the premise that Karen has been MIA in homelessness. I would argue differently. Respectfully.
Yeah, and what I was responding to was I'm not answering questions about my campaign finances or anything else. So I agree with the Assemblyman. I'm going to ask Michael, do you want to ask your next question?
Yeah, I think, my question goes back to something I had said earlier, which I think one of the things that may ease the burden of people being concerned about going into homeless shelters is to bring back the faith-based shelters. I know at the end of the Bloomberg administration, I last had worked at Sacred Heart. I'm going to say it was around 2007. And it started actually during the Koch administration, and Mayor Koch, Mayor Dinkins, and into Mayor Giuliani, and then into Mayor Bloomberg. And something at the end of the Bloomberg administration created a rift between the city and the Brooklyn Queens Diocese and all of the parishes. You had about 10 to 20 people coming at night. Some were all male, some were male, female. But you know what? My mom, my aunts, my relatives, they cooked meals and volunteered and brought them in. And people had a good meal. And in the middle of the night, we did the laundry and they had clean clothes, and we would bring clothes and shoes. I myself helped find people jobs, and they worked. And even if you bring an aspect of years ago, you had a workfare program. If you had welfare, you had to go into the workfare program, and you had to show you were doing something. If there's an incentive for people to know, hey, we're not using you as a number to say we have now, there was 50,000 homeless in 2013. And that number's jumped now to close to what, about almost in the 80s, if I'm correct, give or take. And if I'm wrong, someone can correct me, but it's definitely not 50 anymore. And it shouldn't be that way. So if you go back to what I said earlier, Section 8 vouchers to let people assimilate into housing and not be treated like cattle and numbers and have to worry about going into places like the Umbrella Hotel, which stayed open far too long and should have never even been used in the first place.
Right.
Or in other areas, where you had in Maspeth, you had people in the Holiday Inn Hotel. These are not places to mix people with mental issues or criminal. And I'm not saying one group of people are worse than the other, but you cannot do it that way. It's not working. So we can have 100 of these meetings, and you could have, Lynn could do this, and Andrew Hevesi could do this, and I could do this every day of the week. But unless there's a solution, and I'm offering solutions, because the term is solutions, not shelters. So the solution should be put on the table. And if Governor Cuomo don't like it, then Andrew Hevesi can go on the floor, and you know what? You and Brian Barnwell and Senator Adal and anybody else could go up there, make a stink. You want to protest? Let's all protest. But this has to stop, because the numbers are only going to go up, everybody. They're only going to go up. So either we get on board and work together to stop this, or we're just going to make these people in a worse position than they are now, and their children and their children and their children. And in 5 years from now, it's going to be 100,000. Let's bring it back down, and let's get it down to a lower number. And I think faith-based shelters with someone like Father Mike Lopez in charge will help that number go down.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So we're past our time that we have tonight. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Assembly Member Hevesi. I want to thank Dr. Paoli for joining us tonight, and Father Mike as well. We're going to have resources for homelessness up on the website, schulman2021.com. And I really appreciate this. Has been a really robust discussion. And as people have said, we're not going to solve this evening or in the next few days, but we hopefully will have the seeds for further discussion and to be able to do something with this issue. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Everybody has stayed throughout, so I appreciate it. And if you have any questions that you want to ask me personally, you can write to me at lynn@shulman2021.com. Thank you all very much.